Good morning and welcome to this webinar on democracy in the neighborhood and EU enlargement, Horizon Europe Research Insights. I'm Anne Hogla-Morrissey. I'm Deputy Head of the unit that is in charge of research and innovation related to democracy, equality and culture in the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission. And my team is in charge of the designation Democracy and Governance in Cluster 2 of Horizon Europe. This webinar is divided into two geographical panels. We will have the first panel on the Western Balkans and the second one on the Eastern Neighbourhood and Turkey. And it brings together leading Horizon Europe research projects to discuss democratic governance and EU enlargement in the context of growing geopolitical, security and democratic challenges. And it will offer evidence-based insights into how structural and political constraints shape democratic developments and EU accession processes, with a specific focus on core democracy-related issues. It is now my pleasure to pass the floor to Director Pilar Aguar Fernandez, who will open this webinar by providing a few welcoming remarks. Pilar is in charge of the Directorate People, Health and Society in the Directorate General for Research and Innovation of the European Commission, and this directorate is addressing the challenges posed to human health and well-being, as well as citizens' democratic participation and engagement in a fair and inclusive aging, increasingly digitalized and globalized society. So, dear Pilar, I will give you the floor now for your welcoming address.
Thank you very much, Anne. As you have mentioned, welcome everybody. My name is Pilar Aguar, and I do work on some of the most exciting research areas that I can think of. Naturally, I've worked most of my life in things related to public health, but I must say that the other angle that we, the team, work together in, which is this research on including issues related to cultural, creative, inclusive society, security, and so on and so forth, is as exciting and possibly even more important. Let me just read to you something that you're very familiar with. It's from the 2007 Treaty of Lisbon, and it says in the Article 1, the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality of life, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of the person belonging to the minorities. I couldn't have said it better myself. Maybe Veronica can unmute. Thank you. Well, as I was saying, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law are the foundation of the Union, of the European Union, because they are enshrined in our treaties. And protecting these values is a central priority for the Commission for the period that we're living on, not only at home, but also abroad. And thus, more recently, in November last year, the EU launched the European Democracy Shield to strengthen resilience within Europe and beyond, because there was growing pressure on all our democratic systems. And the idea or the particular focus was supporting democracy practitioners and fighting threats to democracy, as I say, at home, but also in accession countries. And that's pretty important because you know that one of the core principles, one of the key areas on the accession process is the progress on rule of law and the respect of fundamental rights. Without that, there is no accession process possible. So we do believe that strong democracies in the neighborhood, whether there are accession countries or not yet there, are essential. They are essential for the stability, for the security and the prosperity of the whole continent. And we know, we see it all the time, every day, at every moment, that democracy today faces very serious challenges coming from very different places. There is disinformation, there is foreign interference, there is hybrid threats, and there is inside each country democratic backsliding. This hasn't been made or has been made even possibly worse with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which has reshaped our security environment and increased the urgency to tackle democracy resilience. So today, the projects that will be presented in fundings, they are funded by our framework program for research and innovation called Horizon Europe under the Cluster 2 but more specifically under what the destination that is called democracy and governance. These projects have focused on understanding particularly the obstacles to democratic reform, including things like institutional weaknesses, declining trust, divided societies, and so on and so forth. And they also looked at how digital transformation and artificial intelligence are shaping the public debate, and what is the impact and the interferences possible in the new media. So all of these projects have produced very concrete outputs. Those outputs can be policy toolkits. Those outputs can be digital platform, best practices collection, and even more importantly, strategic foresight that is in support of for decision maker like us in the European Commission, but even more importantly, I would say, decision makers elsewhere, like the practitioners that are doing their work in the enlargement and neighborhood countries. So this is really important, and it is then a key issue that we are able to do this knowledge transfer, because partners in these countries have been actively involved to ensure that these recommendations really reflect the local needs and the realities, the local realities, because otherwise they wouldn't be really very useful, would they? So we believe that this strategy of the EU as a democratic partner, and we believe also that this gives science-based evidence that would support the reforms that are needed. And let me say that one of the constant issues that we have addressed in the framework program for research and innovation is the importance of societal sciences and humanities that can develop this research on these areas. It's essential to support the societies to adapt to democratic institutions and the new challenges. And while doing this, what we want to do is also preserve the fundamental values. So this is not only about supporting democracy in the neighborhood. It's about investing in a stable, investing in a resilience, and investing in a secure Europe for all of us, for all of future and the future generations. So with this, I would really like to thank the project for sharing the research and the insight and their outputs with all of you, because indeed this work makes a real contribution to strengthening democracy, as I said before, not only in Europe but beyond. So with this, I just have to end by wishing you a very productive and inspiring webinar, and I do really look forward to discussions ahead. Thank you, everyone, and the floor is yours again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pilar, for this introduction. And let us then get started. We have two panels ahead of us, and we'll start with the first panel, which is related to the Western Balkans. And the second one will come after a short technical break, and that one will focus on the Eastern Neighbourhood and Turkey. And in both panels, we will first listen to the outcomes of the research conducted over the past few years and listen to the important recommendations to policymakers, not only for us in the European Commission at the EU level, but also of course, nationally. And we will see how these relate to further strengthening democratic resilience across the regions, and how to address core democracy-related challenges in the very important context of enlargement. We will first have presentations on core research outcomes, which then will be followed by a questions and answers session. First with a few guided questions from the moderators, and then questions from the audience. So let us now start with the first panel dedicated to the Western Balkans. And I am very pleased to give the floor to our first panelist, who is Professor Dr. Sonja Grim, full professor and holder of the Chair of International Relations and European Studies at the Julius Maximilians University Würzburg of Germany. She is the coordinator and scientific lead of the Embrace Horizon Europe project, and a founding member of the research network External Democracy Promotion, which is investigating international democracy promotion in a comparative perspective. And Sonja's research is focusing on democracy promotion and state building in transitioning, fragile and post-conflict context. And now we will hear more about the current accession process. Sonja will also provide a comparative analysis of progress and setbacks among candidate countries and address the strategic role of key candidates in the enlargement process. So without further ado, Sonja, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for having me and for this very kind introduction. I start sharing my slides and drive you through my presentation. So I hope this works now. Yeah, thank you very much. We started the Embrace project in overseeing the situation in the neighborhood, and you all are very well aware of the fact that we observe crisis and conflicts, de-democratization and autocratization. The map that I show you on the left-hand side is from 2016, but unfortunately the situation has not really improved ever since. When we started the Embrace project, very briefly afterwards, Russia started its full-scale invasion into Ukraine. And we observe in the entire neighborhood de-democratization. That means pressure on judicial independence, a lack or a reduction of media freedom, shrinking space for civil society, and also a lot of pressure on higher education, for example, what we currently observe both in Georgia and Serbia. So we speak in research about de-democratization and autocratization. And within Embrace, we wanted to better understand how these de-democratization or autocratization processes occur. So what you see here on this slide is our analytical framework. We started to think about the political domestic arena in enlargement and candidate or ENP neighborhood countries located in the East, in the Western Balkans, and in the South of the neighborhood of the European Union. And we focused within Embrace on actors and structures in order to capture and better understand what blocks effective democratization and why it is so difficult for the EU to support democratization from the outside. So we factor in the actors' behavior, the institutions, and the structures, and together, this is our argument, they explain why we observe de-democratization and autocratization in the neighborhood. What you can see here are the different work packages of Embrace. So we focused on different subtopics, so to say, on popular uprisings, on autocratic resilience and the role that blockage elites at the top of the states play, on peace-building situations after violent conflicts, and on the geopolitical situation. So the role that big powers such as Russia or China or former friends, so to say, the US play. In this presentation now, I would like to focus on work package 4 that dealt with popular uprisings. Why so? In this package, we observed political order after political uprising situations of public contention. And we wanted to understand how these civil society actors, how political uprising movements succeed in achieving small-scale political gains, small-scale democratic improvements. We do not say that these situations or these movements can achieve major democratization. This is probably not possible. We don't observe this anywhere in the neighborhood. But we can see that under specific conditions, political uprisings succeed in achieving democratic gains, democratic improvements. This work package has focused on different countries in the entire neighborhood. So Serbia and North Macedonia, Western Balkan countries are included. But what I would like to advocate here is that we also learn from a comparative approach, from comparative insights over the entire neighborhood. So we include here 9 different countries. We selected 21 episodes of public contention situations where democratic gains could be achieved and where democratic gains could not be achieved, allowing us to study the conditions under which these democratic gains could effectively be achieved. And we also studied what the EU did in these situations and what the effects have been. Either the EU supported successfully these democratic gains, or the EU contributed to block to achieve democratic gains. 15 colleagues from 7 institutions inside Embrace contributed to this research and conducted both archival research, desk studies, and over 150 interviews with stakeholders, civil society actors, EU officials, and also, when possible, state officials. And what I would like to present here are our key findings on how the political gains could be achieved. What you see in the first bullet points are our 6 main conditions that explain under which conditions the actors can indeed succeed small-scale democratic gains in the aftermath of a popular uprising. First of all, we observed that civil society actors who have been already active before the uprising, who could gain a specific social capital, were successfully able to facilitate achieving small-scale democratic gains. Second, it was important that formal bridges to the political system exist, so that these civil society actors are formally engaged in political reform processes after these popular uprisings. Third, it was important that the civil society actors engaged in the process technically aligned with what the political actors, the decision makers, wanted to achieve. So in very specific, very concrete reform processes, for example, a judicial reform or a social justice reform, it was important that from a technical side, both sides, the civil society actors and the political actors, aligned. Political uprisings might change the constellation of power. And for those civil society actors that were confronted with a changing constellation of power, it was definitively easier to get engaged in the political process. We also observed a couple of episodes where the political constellation of power did not change. And there it was definitively not possible for civil society actors to achieve small-scale democratic gains. Fifth, it's important for these actors to have a broad coalition among civil society actors. And broad means here from different parts of the society, so a horizontal wide scope of a coalition, and also in vertical terms, so that the civil society coalition, the popular uprisings, includes grassroots movements, established civil society organization from inside the country, and also from transnational civil society. This facilitated the popular uprisings and the civil society actors included in these popular uprisings to achieve democratic gains. And the last and sixth factor is civil society autonomy. I've said before that it's important for these actors to have formally the right to get engaged into political processes. Nevertheless, it's also important for them to keep a certain distance to political actors, not to be fully captured by the political system, but to, let's say it this way, keep a watchdog function within the transition process. I don't want to report on what the EU did to block or unintentionally to block the reform process, but I would like to focus on how the European Union, through its democracy promotion support, could positively contribute to success of bottom-up actors, of civil society actors, of popular uprisings. So the EU, before these uprisings started, could support civil society and provide core support to these organizations. It could foster thematic workshops and capacity building across actor types. This is a very important contribution, capacity building, so enabling civil society actors to understand the technicalities of reform processes, to formulate positions, and to get engaged in a professional way in the reform process. And also very important was the leverage of the EU to encourage inclusive transition processes. So the EU could, in the successful, let's put it differently, when the EU positively supported the civil society actors and encourage them to get engaged, and also put pressure on the incumbent elites to allow civil society actors to contribute. This resulted in a more inclusive and more transparent, more fairer reform process that ended up in small-scale political gains. It's important to say, nevertheless, that overall work of Embrace, we can clearly see that the EU prioritizes stability over democracy. And what we found is that for the European Union's democracy promotion approach, it is best to assist bottom-up actors to achieve these small-scale democratic gains when such gains are seen as contributing to the stabilization of new democratic regime. So stability and democracy are not things that are set apart, but they should go in hand. And in our view, the EU can and should definitively support both things at the same time. This leads me to the policy recommendations that we can formulate on the basis of our findings. And I separate this in two parts: before the political transition and once a window of opportunity for political transition has opened. So before a political transition is underway, the EU can assist bottom-up actors with core support. That means to prepare civil society actors, to professionalize them, to support key positions, and allow for higher running cost eligibility in order to strengthen organizational capacity, organizational sustainability, and the strategic autonomy. So to build this political, this social capital that the civil society actors will then profit once a popular uprising, a political transition is underway. Second, it's from our side a good idea to diversify support to actors that receive support, to expand the scope of actors that are allowed to get support, because this, in our view, creates new initiatives. It allows to design new initiatives, and it creates also a positive perception on the EU and as an organization that is open to more inclusive and locally driven processes. At the moment, the criticism against the way how the EU promotes democracy and what it perceives as democratic is overall visible in the entire neighborhood. So I think the EU would do good to support more inclusive and locally driven processes. And it's also important that the EU helps to safeguard democratic potential by supporting those spaces that still exist. And there are still democratic spaces with consultative and co-designing processes. I mean, this is exactly what the EU demanded from us in the Embrace project to do in our research. And I think it can also inform the aid giving, for example, or the ENP, the enlargement process via these techniques. Once a window for democratic transition has opened or a transition process is underway, the EU can and should be engaged more actively. So what we have seen in our research is that so far the EU has mostly been reluctant to support civil society actors or bottom-up actors, and has mostly relied on cooperation with incumbent political elites. So from our research, from the 21 episodes that we studied over the entire neighborhood, we can say that new technical competencies can and should be developed within civil society when such a window of democratic transition has opened. So technical expertise, capacity building on the details of legal frameworks, of political institutional design, and of policy making helps civil society actors to achieve democratic gains. And the last recommendation is make use of the leverage that the EU has. So ensure that civil society is actively included in democratic transition processes. So there is still this leverage, there is still this conditionality mechanism. And the EU, and we have examples for this, has successfully advocated that civil society actors are included, and this leads to more inclusive, more transparent, fairer processes that also end up in small-scale political gains. With small-scale political gains, I mean, for example, the integration of a specific human rights regulation or a certain liberalization of a legal framework. And this indeed supports democratization. This might not end up in democratization at the macro level, but it secures small-scale political gains that is super important for civil society in the neighborhood. If you would like to learn more about Embrace and our project and the writings that we have done, you find here a list of our publications. I also recommend to have a look on our website, where you find a lot of policy reports, a synthesis report, and more. And I'm very happy to respond to your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonja, for this very nice presentation of the core research results related to the project. And we will come back with questions on this interesting topic once we have listened to all the 4 panelists. So we will have a dedicated question and answer session after the 4 presentations. So let us now move to the second panelist, which is Mrs. Anna Maria Berinovska, who is head of the Center for European Integration and a researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Societas Civilis in Skopje, North Macedonia, where she leads research on EU integration and regional cooperation. And Anna Maria will provide an overview of disinformation and foreign information manipulation and interference in the region, with a specific focus on Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And she will provide an analysis of how disinformation becomes politically effective when adopted by domestic elites. And she will also touch upon implications for democratic resilience and enlargement dynamics. She is here representing the project Geopower EU of Horizon Europe. So with these words, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Anna Maria for your presentation.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well and you can see the presentation, right? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Before turning to our research specifically, let me briefly situate our research within the broader framework of the Geopower EU project. Geopower EU is a Horizon Europe project examining how the European Union can strengthen its strategic autonomy and geopolitical capacity in its neighborhood, particularly in the context of intensifying external influence and democratic vulnerability. This project is built
Excuse me, your presentation is not in the presentation mode, so this is might be the problem why you're not able to go
okay,
ahead.
just a moment, sorry. What about see it now?
To my hand, it's still not on presentation mode. I might be wrong, but try to move your slides because it is visible anyway.
Okay, and
Yes, it works.
it works? Perfect. So the project is built around our central analytical question, and that is how do the strategic ambition of the external actors, such as the US, China, Turkey, and Russia, interact with the strategic orientation of the neighboring states, and how this interaction actually shapes the EU foreign policy responses. In other words, with Geopower EU, we are seeking to understand not only the external geopolitical competition, but also how domestic political dynamics within the neighboring countries mediate and transform external influence. Within this framework, this information is analyzed as one of the key instruments for geopolitical contestation. We are not treating this information as information disorder problem, but more of a strategic tool that shapes public perception, influences political alignment, and ultimately affects the EU credibility and enlargement dynamics. So our contribution with this particular research as part of the Geopower EU is to examine how this information operates at the intersection of external ambition and domestic political utility, and what that means for democratic resilience and the EU strategic planning. But first, let me briefly explain our project. Within the Geopower EU project for this particular research, we adopted a mixed method comparative design. We have 4 case studies, them being Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine. However, for the purpose of this presentation, I will focus the findings on Western Balkans, more specifically on Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. We adopted a triangulation model where we have semi-structured elite interviews, a public opinion survey with more than 1,000 responders per country, and social media sentiment analysis. And this model allowed us to connect structural conditions, elite behavior, and public perception patterns. Our first core finding concerns domestic political incentives, and across the case studies, these information narratives gained traction where local elite found them politically useful. In Serbia, the case study and findings show that the pro-governmental media framed student protests as foreign-sponsored color revolutions, aligning them domestic dissent with global conspiracy theory narratives. While in Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly within the Republika Srpska, political actors selectively embedded pro-Kremlin narratives into ethnopolitical competition and have portrayed the EU as imposing unwanted centralization. In both cases, domestic actors acted as gatekeepers. They did not merely just transmit foreign narratives, but they curated them and localized them and adapted to the national context. This suggests that the factor shaping this information impact, it's not the content or the narrative origin, but more the political utility of that particular narrative. Our second finding concerns the structural resonance, and it shows us that this information becomes effective when it aligns with long-standing grievances. Given the structural vulnerability of the Western Balkan region, we see that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, ethnopolitical fragmentation and entity-based media ecosystems created that segmented informational spaces, and in Serbia, a high concentration of the media and executive dominance facilitated centralized narrative amplification. And the structural conditions do not determine the outcomes on their own, but more shape who is vulnerable and how the narratives resonate with the citizens' feelings and emotions. the same narrative can have a completely different effect depending on the institutional and social context. To systematically compare resilience, we developed the resilience framework, combining four dimensions, them being political competition and legitimacy, media freedom and independence, social cohesion, civic counter disinformation capacity. We then operationalized institutional resilience and social resilience comparatively, and the results showed us that resilience correlates strongly with institutional integrity, where institutions amplify disinformation, as in context when we have a high media capture, resilience remains weak. And when you have cooperation with the civil society, then resilience increases. That brings me to a crucial implication, and that disinformation, we often treat it as a communication problem, but our findings show that it's a fundamentally governance problem. Fact-checking and media literacy are necessary, but insufficient on their own. And resilience increases when institutional accountability, media pluralism, and civic engagement operated within a whole of a society framework. However, we lately hear that word and that phrase quite often, but it is very important to reflect that whole of a society coordination is effective only when a certain extent of political openness exists. Where governments themselves instrumentalize disinformation, civic efforts remain structurally constrained, and supporting civil society is very essential. However, without institutional integrity, its impact remains quite limited. And throughout the whole paper, we tried to see how this information affects the EU credibility and undermines the EU accession path of the countries in the specific country cases. And we see that throughout the survey and the sentiment analysis, we see emerging patterns relevant to EU credibility. In Serbia, support for the EU accession has declined below 40%. And in the same time, the digital sentiment analysis shows growing emotional negativity towards Western actors. Same goes for Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, in the region, the declarative support for EU membership remains still high, and there's not a single government that has opposed EU membership so far in the Western Balkan region. However, going through the social media sentiment analysis, we see negative sentiments towards the EU and the Western actors, and that gap of declarative support, however, negative perception creates the gap where disinformation actually is allowed to grow and be amplified. So let me conclude with 3 insights as part of our recommendations. First, that disinformation in the Western Balkans is domesticated and politically curated. It's not more about the origin, but of the narrative and the content, but who actually gains certain political profit or benefit. And resilience is institutional before it's communicative. Countering disinformation requires addressing the political incentives and not only the content. For that purposes, strengthening democratic institutions is central to strengthening disinformation resilience. Thank you. You can reach out to us for more of our research. And also visit our website of GeoPower EU. I'll be here for questions. So.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, for this presentation. And as said before, we will have time after the two following presentations for questions and comments from the audience. And now let us move to the third speaker, who is Professor Morten Boas, who is research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI. And he is here representing the EU Re-engage project, where he is responsible for data collection and analysis in the Western Balkans and in the Eastern Neighbourhood. And Morten, he has organized 6 large-scale surveys about trust, quality of government, and foreign policy preferences. And the data that is based on a vignette surveys represent an intriguing view into how citizens of, for example, Serbia think of trust in governance and hybrid regime. I think somebody needs to mute their mic. And Morten will focus on hybrid threats in an enlargement context, the role of transnational criminal networks and the impact of governance and integration processes, and on how EU democracy support works. So, dear Morten, I will give you the floor for your presentation.
There we go. Thank you, Anna, and thanks for the invitation. I hope you all can hear me and that you can see the screen that I'm sharing. Thanks. So I'm representing the Re-engage process, re-engaging with neighbors in a state of war and tensions. And the aim of this project, Re-engage, is to analyze how EU democracy support has worked and is working in the situation of war, increased geopolitical tensions, where hybrid threats intensifies. Our working assumption is that hybrid threats are hard to prevent, particularly in the social media space, because if you want to sort of completely prevent it, I mean, then you have left with the choice to stop closing off internet.
Excuse me, Mr. Boas, your audio is corrupted. We cannot hear you properly. So could you just, from the very beginning?
Sorry, can you hear me better now?
Yes, now it's better. Your presentation is also not in representation mode. It is visible, but if you might change the presentation mode, otherwise I can share the slides for you.
My screen says that I'm sharing, but it's not sharing.
It's fine. It's fine. Now it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's start over again. I mean, thanks for the introduction. I hope you can hear me. I'm representing the Re-engage project, re-engaging with neighbors in a state of war and geopolitical tension. Our aim is to analyze how EU democracy support has worked and is working in a situation of war and increased geopolitical tensions, where hybrid threats intensifies.
Excuse me, the audio is still not perfect, so it's really difficult to hear you. It's better, but
I really don't know what I can do with that.
Now it is fine. So if you keep this position, maybe.
Okay, I'll try to do that. I'm sorry because usually it works fine from my office, but I don't know what is happening actually, and it's not that much I can do about it. But if this is better, I'll try to sit like this. Okay. Our working assumption is that hybrid threats are hard to prevent, but societal resilience is possible. Working on horizontal trust is key. And then is the question, what's the situation in the Western Balkans? We have a comprehensive analysis of the evolution of what we call the hybrid regimes in the Western Balkans. This is supplemented by our analysis of EU rule of law and democracy assistance support throughout a large period. And then we supplement this with a comprehensive vignette survey in 6 countries, Albania, Bosnia, and Serbia. And we also have done the same thing in Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I'm not going to talk about that. But this vignette survey also includes a vignette model, which allows us to analyze respondents' external partner preferences. And this vignette module is closely linked to our foresight analysis of the role of Russia, China, Turkey, and the US in the region. So this very short on our collaboration and methodology. The vignette survey is implemented with re-engaged partners, the Institute of Contemporary History in Serbia, the European University of Tirana in Albania, the University of Sarajevo, of course, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have done quota sampling in capitals and what we have defined as secondary cities in Albania, that's Tirana and Vlore. In Bosnia, it's of course Sarajevo and Tuzla, and in Serbia, it's Belgrade and Novi Sad. And in total, we have a total of almost 1,700 respondents based on quota sampling, male and female, age in the spans of 18 to 29, 30 to 54, and 55 plus. This is based on face-to-face interviews done in randomized designated location of 600 square meters in the cities, where quotas are randomly assigned across the pinpoints. So how does this look like? If you look at Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, what you see is not necessarily very surprising. We see that there is a relatively high horizontal trust. People tend to trust relatives and kin, neighbors, and from there it basically goes down. Although we see that Albania is sort of the anomaly here, with slightly higher levels of trust throughout. But it's interesting to see. I mean, if you look at the level of trust in politicians in the case of Serbia and Bosnia, it is extremely low. Extremely low. And it's not much better when it comes to local government and national governments. Who's suggesting that there is something very, very wrong here. Okay, let me then move on. Because if you look at people's geopolitical preferences, things become quite interesting. This is captured through vignettes that has presented the respondents with what we call plausible but fictional scenarios. Basically, they have been in these three countries. They were presented with the story that their country had been presented, is faced with a very, very severe economic crisis, and then they were asked to evaluate their trust in relief packages from, here you see, from the European Union, from Russia, from China, and Turkey. And as you see, I mean, with the exception perhaps of Serbia, the EU is the preferred external partner. Russia and China is not very popular anywhere, and towards Turkey, people seem to be quite indifferent. But note the role, but note Serbia here. What we can read from the spider chart of Serbia is that Serbs don't trust anybody. Russia is not doing much better than the European Union here. And that is interesting to note, and it also relates to something that I will try to focus on a more positive note, and that is the large-scale political protests that emerged after the collapse of the Novi Sad train station. If we then look at media habits and hybrid interference in Serbia, we ask people which media outlets do you trust the most for providing correct information, or which of these media outlets do you use the most in your daily life? And what's interesting to note here is that what comes out on top is the more traditional ones. But it's interesting to know that the three regular stations, media outlets and stations that is either directly linked to Russia, like Russia Today, and Happy TV and Pink TV, which are both have an ownership of oligarchs that are seen as closely aligned to Moscow. Not that many people actually watch this, And of the people who watch this, it's very few who sort of see this as legitimate sources of providing for information. And this is important to take a note of, because it suggests that people's digital literacy is not necessarily as low as one may expect. Many people are watching this, but they maybe mainly seem to do so out of more amusement purposes rather than this Think TV or Happy TV with their small news bulletin being a source of legitimate and correct political information. And that's important to take note of. And we have a similar sort of information from all these 6 countries, also from, of course, from Bosnia and from Albania. But to end on a more happy note, because, and this relates to what the previous speakers was also saying, because there is something that is going on here in this region, and of particular interest is this new youth activism. The Serbian protest that emerged after the collapse of the roof of the train station in Novi Sad. And this is, we have followed the events, what we call these festival protests in Belgrade, Novi Sad, and elsewhere in Serbia quite closely. And this is a form of payment politics that is part political protest, it's part, but it's also part of a festival, a theater, and a performance. But it is also an extremely interesting attempt of both reclaiming a more inclusive Serbian nationhood, which is in a way illustrated by the picture that we see on at least my right-hand side of this slide, of a Serb and a Bosnian women standing together in protest against the Musiki regime. And from our interviews and project process tracing of EU support to both rule of law and democracy assistance throughout this region, but also in the eastern neighborhood, it's pretty clear, and this sort of fits quite well with Sonja's conclusion from the Embrace project, that if the EU is really to sort of try to make a larger inroad with its democracy and rule of law assistance, it needs to become much better at finding ways of working with these kind of, what we call it, grassroots movements, spontaneous protests, or youth-driven, as in the fact of Serbia, that is representing a new form of what we may call Generation Z protests that we also seen elsewhere in the world, that we also seen elsewhere in the world, that traditional donors that want to promote democracy have huge problems of trying to find a way of working with. It will be difficult in the case of Serbia, because we know that many of these teams who lead these demonstrations, they are not looking too favorably on any external partners, including the EU. But it's important that the EU, if it really wants to strengthen its role in democracy promotion in this part of the world, that it needs to find a way of not only working with established civil society actors, or not only working with established opposition political parties, it needs to find a way of these kind of movements, because they represents, as we've seen in the case of Serbia, a much larger threat to the current way of ruling Serbia than any of the traditional opposition partners, whether it has been in politics or in civil society, has managed so far. So this is an important challenge to the EU, but it's also probably the only way of creating greater resilience to hybrid threats, because particularly those that comes from the social media sphere. It's almost impossible to prevent the spread of it, but we can become better at helping societies become more resilient towards these kind of hybrid threats, creating the kind of traction among people that they seek to attract. And I believe that the student protest that we have seen in Serbia is one way of creating that type of grounded resilience that is needed. I'll end there, but just to wrap up, horizontal networks matters a lot in this region, and they will continue to matter because vertical trust remains low, and it will continue to remain low for quite some time. Why is that the case? It's the case because throughout the Western Balkans, what we find in our own service and in similar services is that people have very low levels of satisfaction with key governance indicators like the economy, employment, infrastructure, education, health, and so on. Very low satisfaction with key governance indicators, which, as long as this remains low, vertical trust will also remain low. Trust in the European Union is uneven. It is low in Serbia for many reasons. The lithium case certainly didn't. The lithium mining case certainly didn't help in that regard. It's more medium, although skeptical in Bosnia, but it is very high in Albania. There is something to build on here for the EU, but if it is to become a more important actor in the important political situation at this moment in the Western Balkans, it needs to find a way to shift gear so that it can engage more directly, more actively, and more deeply with these kind of more spontaneous movements that emerges, because it needs to find a way of dealing with bottom-up factors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Morten, for this presentation, and we will soon come back to questions. But first, let us turn to the last final speaker in this panel, who is Professor Florian Bieber, Professor of Southeast European History and Politics at the University of Graz, and he's coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group, as well as leader of the work package 6 of the Reunir Horizon Europe project. And Florian will bring up the external influence in the region, covering all the countries, but with a specific focus on Serbia and how this external influence can be countered through democracy promotion, restoring credibility through democratic conditionality, the geopolitical turn in enlargement policy, as well as the role of the EU as a global promoter of democracy. So these topics will be touched upon by Florian. So I will now give you the floor, Florian. Over to you.
Thanks, Anne. Unfortunately, I only have 3 minutes to do my presentation as we're running out of time due to delays previously, and I have a hard deadline at 10:30, as I noted. So I will be very brief in my comments. Some of the points have been mentioned by my previous speakers. I will make 6 brief points which derive from the Reunir research, which we conducted over the last year through focus groups and interviews. The first point I would like to make, looking at external actors, is that many of the external actors, in fact, are not external at all in the Western Balkans. The main disruptive actor in our interviews and research is, in fact, less China, Russia, or other actors, but Serbia, which is by most neighboring countries seen as a disruptive actor, which in many ways uses resources from external actors such as Russia and China for its own role in the region, but most neighboring countries see Serbia as the main source of negative influence in the region. In fact, the external actors such as Russia or China are much less seen as direct threats, but rather are channeled through local gatekeeper elites and don't act autonomously. So most, as Morten has mentioned, most of the disinformation comes from domestic sources which are controlled by governments rather than by external malign actors. The second point I'd like to make is that there is also a malign role of EU member states. Hungary is particularly noted as a country which has had a very disruptive influence in the Western Balkans and has aligned itself with external actors such as Russia and China in the region, and has been, in a certain way, an interlocutor in promoting those ideas. The third point I would like to make is that the United States is seen as very unclear in the region, but certainly there is a lot of hedging towards the role of the United States. So on one side, it's trying to remain on the good side of the Trump administration, while on the other side, not being sure what is the intention of the Trump administration. And I think we can overall note that the signals have been mixed. Lifting of sanctions against Milorad Dodik has certainly signaled some good relations between regional autocrats and nationalists and the Trump administration, but other elements such as the dropping of the Trump Tower project in Belgrade signal that, at least from economic points of view, the American administration might not always support local autocrats. The fourth point I would like to make is, of course, as others have noted, the democratic fragility in the region remains very pertinent, remains accentuated by the global fragility of democracy, but this comes in a context of weak democratic institutions which are not consolidating, and where we have what I would call cyclical autocratization, so that change of governments to elections do not necessarily mean an end of autocratic tendencies. And we have, in some cases, of course, deeply embedded autocratic rule, which, despite, as we heard in the case of Serbia, mass protests, has not been successfully challenged and remains, at least for the time being, strong. The last point I would like to make, and then unfortunately I have to wrap up, is that there is in the region a lack of belief in the transformative power of the European Union. So while enlargement is moving ahead with Montenegro and Albania, although there is some skepticism in both countries, especially among civil society and citizens, whether this process is genuine, there's certainly no longer a belief that this process will lead to more democracy or the consolidation of democracy. So if there is any recommendation coming from that, is rethinking with that linkage which has been assumed but does not really exist in the way it was in the past, that EU accession promotes democracy and vice versa. The geopolitical turn of the European Union is seen as, in many ways, in those two countries, that the enlargement process is just ticking the boxes and not supporting profound change. And in the other countries, we've seen, especially in Serbia, that many of those who've been protesting against autocratic rule have not found the EU as an ally. And so there is a real need for the European Union to re-engage with democracy in the region, and not to believe that geopolitics is a reason to drop demands for democracy. And I would there, very important, underline something which Morten, I think, has argued, is that this should not be just the support for conventional civil society organizations, which in fact in many countries do not have citizens' trust, but it is informal groups, it is more ephemeral groups which have much more credibility and much more trust among citizens, and which deserve more support, which does not have to be financial support, but other types of engagement to give them legitimacy. Traditional NGOs in Serbia, in other countries, are often not seen as legitimate interlocutors for society and as representatives of their demands. So with that, unfortunately, I have to conclude, and I also have to, unfortunately, leave the seminar. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Beaver, for this this presentation. And we're sorry for this, that we're running out of time, but I think you brought up some key messages that we can further discuss. So thank you very much, Florian. And with this, I will open up the floor for any questions from the audience. I don't see yet any in the chat, but while we're waiting for participants to raise their hands, I can perhaps myself start with a question. So starting with the first speaker, Sonia, I have a question for you. So related to what we see in the region, and when it comes to the democratic resilience, what would you recommend the European Union to do in the context of global autocratization and de-democratization to facilitate further enlargement? If we could develop a little bit on that.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Of course, I can fully agree to what Florian Bieber said. Global autocratization should not be taken as an excuse not to engage in democracy promotion anymore. I mean, we researchers are very well aware of the fact that it's increasingly difficult to support democracy from the outside. But as your colleague has said in the beginning, the European Union is built on this normative consensus of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And as a normative power, I would advocate still for the fact that the EU should clearly support this in its entire activities to the inside of the EU and to the outside, and also clearly signal this to Western Balkan countries that we are speaking about in this panel, but also to Eastern European countries and also to Southern countries, so located in the Southern Neighbourhood, that for the EU it's a key priority to support democracy, and this can go hand in hand with supporting stability. So this public contention that we see a bit over or everywhere in the neighborhood is due to the fact that there is not sufficient participation and a room for civil society, for grassroots movements, for local networks to get engaged into politics. And this is what concerns people, and they are going on the streets. We are observing this in Serbia, we are observing this in Georgia. And for me, the EU is a very important actor that can clearly support democracy in that regard. And yeah, support also these very important actors.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for this. And please, participants, if you would like to ask a question, you can either use the chat, which you have on the right-hand side, or you can raise your hand.
There are two hands raised, Maria Claudia Bodino and Funda Tekin, as I can see.
Yes, so I'm Maria Claudia Bodino. I'm also a colleague from Anne and Alberto. So thanks a lot for this presentation. I have one question for you, Sonia. If I understood correctly, you mentioned that the European Union is not really helping, let's say, all the civil society bodies, but it's mainly helping the elite of the political parties, correct? Can you please elaborate a bit more on this? Thank you.
Yeah, what we observe in the 21 episodes over the last 2 decades that we have investigated is that the EU's, let's put it this way, natural partner are the political elites, the incumbents in the partner countries. And I mean, in a way, this makes sense because it's a regional organization consisting of member states. The political actors that are elected represent these member states. So the natural partner for these member states and the EU as a whole are the governments in the partner countries, in the neighboring countries. Traditionally, for example, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights and the financial budget that has been provided through this instrument has been minor compared to EPA or the neighborhood financial instruments that the EU uses. So this is maybe no wonder that the governments are the natural partner. But I think in light of the problems that I have described, de-democratization, autocratization, shrinking space for civil society, the shrinking, repression on judicial independence and so forth, it is important to support pro-democratic actors. And we found these pro-democratic actors in the civil realm. That means civil society organizations, grassroots movements, neighborhood networks. So people who are keen on human rights and freedoms. And we think that if you take this fundament of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law serious, then look for these actors who are willing to get engaged in political processes and who are willing to advocate for pro-democratic reforms.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And for this first question, we have a question from Funda Tekin, please.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for this very interesting panel. And I know that there were more panelists on the panel than only Sonia, but I also had a very practical question, follow-up question actually, to Sonia, because you said, one way of, supporting civil society organizations is also, before there's a political uprising, to also provide funding and core funding. But I'm really wondering, with the look into Georgia, with the foreign agent law, and we all in our consortia experience how difficult it is to actually then keep our Georgian partners, in the consortium, and we would actually have to find ways around it, because funding those actors, it becomes increasingly difficult due to the regulation in the country. So how to go about and how to make sure that we can provide financial support to civil society organizations in spite of such laws in the country.
Yeah, indeed, you are right. This is really a difficult context. Let me answer in two ways. First, when it comes to the Georgian situation, we are very much concerned about autocratization that is going on in Georgia at the moment. Very recently, the government, Georgian Dream, has decided to reorganize the university landscape, for example, a law that particularly affects Ilia State University, one of our partners, and will shrink their programs to an absolute minimum. So we perceive this as a clear assault on this university and the potential reservoir of protest that might come out of the student crowd. And this is very problematic. And I think here the EU should use its leverage to clearly signal to the officials that this is not accepted within the European, within Europe, and it's not aligned with standards of academic freedom within Europe. So I think it's important to explain the consequences, what that means, how detrimental the effects on academic quality will be. And here, I think the EU can use its leverage. My second response would be to have a look on a positive example. And I would like to cite here a case that we found in North Macedonia in 2016. In this period, widespread corruption was observed, and civil society protested against the president, who wanted to give a pardon to political elites who were accused of wrongdoing. And the EU in this time commissioned a report based on consultations with civil society organizations who have witnessed the systemic weaknesses of the state related to the rule of law. And this report that the European Commission commissioned served as an intellectual basis for all the protest movements to formulate their requests. And in addition, the EU supported the civil society organizations, the grassroots movements with financial support to increase their professionalism, their capacity. The EU provided diplomatic pressure, and together with this local mobilization, this led in the end to the president rescinding the pardon. So this is for me a typical case for a small-scale political gain that could be achieved because the EU used its leverage, its instruments, such as financial assistance and a monitoring report, in combination with the preferences of the civil society actors. So even in light of a foreign agent law, I think the EU has a lot that it can offer and that it can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. I will ask another question myself now to Anna Maria, because I find the resilience framework that you referred to in your presentation very interesting. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what this resilience framework reveals about the relationship between institutional legitimacy and social cohesion in the Western Balkans.
Thank you. We built this framework, and that and based on the findings, it suggests that the institutional legitimacy and the social cohesion are mutually reinforcing, but not automatically aligned. So where institutional resilience is weak, for example, due to media capture or low political legitimacy, social resilience becomes harder to sustain. Even when parts of the society remain mobilized, they're operating without stable institutional channels for accountability. And that tends to produce fragmentation. We see groups retreating into identity-based narratives or parallel information environments. In the same time, social cohesion can partially compensate for institutional weakness, but only up to a certain point, because civil society, we see, especially in the case of Serbia, where civil society independent media can create pockets of resilience, but we see that their effort is ongoing and with no visible result yet. And that shows that if institutions remain distrusted or politicized, these counter efforts face limits and can be framed, as it was mentioned before, as foreign agents or actors supported by foreign external influence. So the relationship, I would say, is dynamic. Legitimacy supports cohesion by making democratic rules credible. And cohesion supports legitimacy by enabling collective resistance and trust.
Thank you very much for this additional perspective related to this. I'm looking at the list of participants. I don't see any hand raised, so I will take the occasion then myself to ask a question to Morten, because your presentation was very interesting, bringing up different perspectives. You touched upon, well, we all know that digital and media literacy are key for vibrant democracy and for citizen active engagement in society. So from your data, what would you say about digital and media literacy and social media habits across the region? If you could say a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, we find that the trouble is, and the problem is not necessarily a lack of media literacy per se, but the fact that many people feel abandoned. They feel that they are living in an environment where they don't move, where the prospects of social mobility is extremely low. They feel caught up in time warps that they cannot escape, and there is a lot of noise around them. And if you then add that to the fact that people, for good reasons, have little reasons to trust governments, they have little reasons also to maybe trust other more formal partners. It means that people can get caught up in these kind of algorithms where they do not necessarily believe everything they hear there or trust everything, but they end up trusting nothing. And that is a challenge in itself. We see this in Serbia, where I do think that the student movement and the student protest is some sort of antidote to this. Because the only resilience against these form of hybrid threats is when people believe in something and don't believe and rather than believing in nothing. And it is important to try to find ways of dealing with what we may call different resilience actors. And these resilience actors are not necessarily the formal civil society actors. These are actors in the communities, where they have some sort of trust. These could be among those heavily involved in, for example, the Serbian student protest, but we also see similar, although on a smaller scale, initiatives both in Bosnia but also in Albania. And the challenge for an actor like the European Union is trying to sort of engage with these more sort of horizontal movements in such a way that the EU can help creating the space for them without making them their own actors of change. Because if this is to work, if these spontaneous, more grassroots movements, which I think is the larger chance of a more positive political trajectory in this part of the world is to work, they need to be their own agents of change and not become the European Union's agent of change. And so far, I mean, as we see with regard to the student-led protest in Serbia, I mean, this has been a challenge for the European Union, how to deal with these kind of movements. But they represent the largest potential for political change in this part of the world. And if the EU wants to stay engaged as a meaningful actor, it needs to sort of find a way of dealing with this. We realize that how the whole setup of the external activities of the Union makes this difficult, because it's difficult for any kind of these type of actors. This is not only a challenge for the EU, it's a challenge for all large and small external, more official actors, how to deal with it. So there is a lot of sort of work and soul searching that needs to be done here by researchers, but also by those involved in this on the political side. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. We will go to Anja, who had a question.
Hello, thank you very much for the webinar. I have kind of like a more broad question that maybe apply to all of you. When we talk about like you as supporter and promoter of democracy in the neighborhood and in candidate state, it feels like there is some kind of a gridlock in this process, especially in Serbia. If we take Serbia as a crucial case and the more like problematic case for the European Union, there even the instruments of supporting civil society proved to be insufficient. And in recent studies, for example, Fagan and EDUS, they show that there is, in terms of the civil society, there was a dual change when civil society became more oriented towards EU funding and works towards getting the EU funding, and the population see that and doesn't have a trust in the civil society. So there is an increasing gap between actual population and civil society. So does in the conditions when the EU enlargement getting more and more politicized and get this geopolitical focus and probably going to be more and more politicized and portrayed, is there is a chance how to bring back the EU influence in this region? I hope you understood my question. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Anja. Who would like to reply on this? Yes, Morten?
I think this goes back to what I was trying to communicate just a few minutes ago, that for several reasons, at least in Albania, now in Serbia, and also partly in Bosnia, I mean, there has been a growing skepticism towards the European Union for good and for bad reasons, and one can have a debate about that. But there is a growing skepticism. There's a growing sort of anti-system skepticism in these countries, which means that if they see that the civil society organization becomes sort of too involved with the EU, people start to get more skeptical, because they think that then they are in promoting another agenda than a local or national agenda. And this is something that the EU, as any other large-scale donor, needs to find a way of dealing with. How to remain engaged, how to remain supportive, but do so with the lightest possible footprint, so that it becomes very clear that these initiatives that the EU tries to support, they are local initiatives, they are local agents of change, and they don't become external agents of change. And this is a dilemma that we see worldwide for donors involved in these kind of civil society democracy support. We see it also in a number of other fields, from attempts to counter radicalization to democracy support. The challenge that this represents, particularly for large-scale donors that, for several reasons, would like to sort of plant their flag on what is seen as successful projects.
Thanks for this perspective, Morten. I hope Anja is happy with that reply. And I see, because time is soon running out, but I see we have also a question from Marco Schwartz. Marco?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation. I have a question regarding the support for EU accession in the 10 candidate countries, or with a special regard to the Western Balkans. If we take a look in the long perspective, we've seen some figures that only 40% of the population in Serbia is still supporting the EU or any accession. But if we look now at other countries that has been in the waiting room for quite some time, Montenegro or North Macedonia, can we see a decline of EU support within the last 10 years? Do you have these figures to see if this has a big effect on the candidate countries, on the population, if they are in this kind of limbo for a long time, or what the effect of this waiting room position? Thank you.
Thank you, Marco, for this question. And
I can go ahead.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for the question. I can speak for the region, as we conducted the public survey, but also I've been conducting the public survey for North Macedonia for the last 6 years for the EU, for the perception for EU membership, and we have seen a decline in the support for the EU membership, but not as strong as in Serbia. So right now in Macedonia, it's around 70% for for a country that has been in the process for 20 years now. So it's still, I would say it's very, apologies. I would still say it's a very high percentage of people supporting the EU membership in North Macedonia, having in mind the longevity of the process. And in countries like Albania and Montenegro, where we see progress in the last in the last year, we see that the support remains on a very high level. So the decline is mostly in Serbia and a bit stronger also in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria. And okay, Sonia, would you like to come in on the question in the chat?
Yes, of course. So Annika Paolo raised the question about global actors like President Trump and their effect on increasing distrust. And I agree with this observation. And I would like to very clearly say that the EU can here make a difference. We have two recent examples in global politics where we can clearly see that what the EU does and how it speaks or makes a difference. So one example is the Greenland issue that you are all well aware of. And for me, this was a very clear signal of standing together and saying no to President Trump's demands helped to retaliate what he wanted to achieve. So the EU, I think, did a very good job after quite a while, one must confess, to say clearly no to these demands and succeeded with this policy. And the other thing that I would like to raise is the Canadian president's speech at Davos. So I think he showed a way forward how democratic powers can align, should align, and find their way through this new geopolitical competition that is emerging. Annika is totally right to say that internal divisions do not help, but the way how the EU behaves and how it speaks, and a clear commitment, both in rhetoric and in actions to democracy, I think would do very good and would also support recreating trust in the EU. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And I think that this will conclude this panel. We will have a little break of a few minutes before we start with the second panel related to the Eastern Partnership and Turkey. But I would like to thank the speakers for presenting very interesting findings, and many thanks for the recommendations to us in the European Commission as well. It's very helpful for us. So many thanks to Sonia, Anna Maria, and Morten, and also to Florian, who unfortunately had to leave. So many thanks, and please, if you wish to stay, please do so, because there will be very interesting presentations now in a few minutes' time. And just a reminder to the participants, we will share the slides, and we will also share a fact sheet based on the findings of those projects that are being presented here today, but my colleague Alberto Domini will come back on that in the second panel. So thanks a lot, and let's take a short break of 5 minutes before we continue with the second panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I think we can restart again with the webinar. My name is Alberto Domini. I'm the policy officer also at the DG for Research and Innovation, specifically in the unit for democracy, equality, and culture, specifically from the so-called democracy team, together with my colleague Anne. And I will be moderating the second panel of this webinar of today, second and last panel, which will be on the another part of the region, which is in the scope of this event, which is the Eastern Partnership countries, and also Turkey. We will have a speaker specifically bringing insights on Turkey. So without further ado, because I understand we are a bit late, I would ask the three speakers to turn on their camera. I'm joined today by Dr. Karina Shiroki, Associate Professor in International Relations at the Stockholm University in Sweden. And she's a member also of the Embrace project, like Sonia, that we saw before. I'm also joined by Dr. Marina Rabinovic, which is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Public Policy and Governance at the Kiev School of Economics. She's also a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Social Sciences at the Arctic University of Norway, and she's instead from the Redemos project, another project, a very successful project that ended last year. And the third speaker is somebody that we already saw on the screen a few minutes before, Professor Funda Tekinen, who is director at the Institute of European Politics in Berlin, and who is affiliated to the Invigorate EU project. I see all of you. No, well, I see Funda for now. Yes, also Karina. And amazing. Unfortunately, we were supposed also to have Professor Magdalena Gora, who's professor in political sciences at the Institute of European Studies at the Jagiellonian University, but she couldn't make it due to some problems that she had with her flight. But I can already tell that we're going to share all the information about this other project, which is the Ship Them EU project, together with the rest of the materials that will be shared, together with the fact sheet that Anne was mentioning before, and other notes in the following days after this webinar. So while I let the first speaker, who's going to be Karina, if you agree, take control of the screen, just to remind you that Karina Shiroki, she's from the, I'm sorry if my pronunciation is not the best one. She's from the Embrace project, and her research mainly is focused on the international relations with a specific emphasis on human rights, also external policies and democracy promotion of the EU, and also on specific issues related to this, such as disinformation, crisis preparedness, and the impact of the war of Russia in Ukraine. Karina, could you? Yes, I see that something is loading. Amazing. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alberto, for your kind invitation and the introduction. And thank you to the brilliant presenters during the first panel who have already kicked off this discussion. I'll try to build in part on the discussion, sharing insights, as you say, further away from the Embrace project, where I was a part of. And in my particular research, I focused predominantly on large analysis, where my package was in charge of data collection for the project, and shedding light on the entire neighborhood, which we understood pretty broadly in terms of Eastern Partnership, Western Balkans, and Southern neighbors. In my presentation, although I'll be focusing mostly on Eastern Partnership countries, making some links to other regions just for the sake of comparison. The structure of my presentation will focus on two main elements. The first element is discussing the promotion of EU's vision of democracy. Basically, what does the EU understand when it says democracy promotion in Eastern Partnership countries? And the second focus of my presentation will be on the EU's internal factors that may facilitate and or obstruct effective democracy promotion. For the sake of saving on time and giving space for others to contribute to this discussion, I will be focusing only on EU internal factors. And I will be leaving aside at this stage internal third countries dynamics, as well as geopolitical factors that obviously shape the fact of EU's democracy engagement outside of the EU. So to the discussion of the actual vision of democracy that the EU promotes in third countries. We have conducted a systematic study in Embrace project where we looked into all of the European Commission's country reports on Eastern Partnership countries, Western Balkans, and Southern neighbors. So we downloaded all of the reports that are available online from year 2004 to 2020, and we systematically analyzed all of these thousands upon thousands of pages of country reports. Particularly, we paid attention to the democracy section that each of the report contains. These particular graphs visualize references to various elements of democracy that the EU promotes, particularly in Eastern Neighbourhood. So here, theoretically, we built on the embedded democracy conceptual framework, which was originally proposed by Merkel. And we distinguish between core elements of democracy in line with this theory and the surrounding, so to say, a lot of factors that allow for the core elements of democracy to be maintained and sustain external shocks. So when it concerns the core elements of embedded democracy, we can see that in its external promotion of democracy, EU mostly focuses on electoral democracy, so basically referring quite frequently to fair elections, but also to electoral processes surrounding elections. So this is the first element that you can see on the graph. Also, very frequently, these reports relate to political and civil rights that, of course, are very tightly connected to electoral democracy. So we can see here that most frequently references are made to electoral democracy when promoting democracy by the EU. When it comes to other elements that EU promotes, of course, these include human rights, but also various factors that allow for democracy to maintain its functioning despite external shocks, such as stateness, civil society, but also important elements, functioning institutions in the states. But when you compare the vision of democracy across the regions, which I show on the next slide, between Eastern neighbors and Western Balkans, you can see that references to various elements of embedded democracy vary quite a lot across these regions. So now you can compare these two and see that frequency of references to all of the elements, not only of embedded democracy, but also these outer rings that enable democracy, they are much more frequent in terms of the Western Balkans. So already can see that in EU's country reports or European Commission's country reports, much more attention is paid to all of the elements of embedded democracy and the outer rings that enable maintenance of democracy. Kind of Western Balkans are receiving much more attention systematically across the years. And the x-axis for both graphs are set at the same limit, so that you can compare the frequency, relative frequency of various references, which is really important here. So we see here that although electoral elements of democracies that also relate to political and civil rights, although these dominate in these two regions, so the vision must be similar of democracy that the EU promotes, we can see that Western Balkans systematically receive much more attention compared to Eastern Partnership throughout these 2 decades. Of course, these dynamics can very well be explained by the process of accession, when Western Balkans received a very clear promise for being included into the European family, so to say. They were given accession hopes in 2003 at the Thessaloniki summit. Of course, Eastern Partnership haven't had these explicit promises. In fact, cooperation with Eastern Partnership was everything but political integration, right? So it can be here explained, the variance can be explained by the fact that Eastern Partnership countries have been seen historically as very different from Western Balkans in terms of being prospective candidate countries in the future. So that is something that is important to consider here. But also what we show in our research, it is that the way how EU talks about each country and which elements of democracy have to be strengthened in each of the countries is very much embedded into the domestic dynamics, and we can see frequent references to political events. We can see that although vision of democracy is very much similar and electoral democracy dominates the talk of democracy, there's a lot of attention paid to domestic developments and violations of human rights, whatnot. So that one has to bear in mind. So the EU is very much context specific when promoting democracy, although democracy is understood similarly across regions. And the second element of my talk that I'd like to highlight today is the importance of EU's internal factors that are key in EU's success when EU engages externally promoting democracy. And our research in Embrace demonstrates that although EU is consistently promoting democracy using various instruments, the way how these instruments are often applied in a way can try to serve EU domestic interests or member states' interests. So, for example, in our recent paper that we've published last year within the project, we show that although disbursement of aid is conditional on demographic performance of neighboring countries, at the same time, we can see that the high levels of democratic performance is more likely to be associated with more aid when the country which receives this aid exports energy sources to EU member states. So we can see here that aid can be used strategically and inconsistently across countries in the neighborhood. And these strategic interests can, in a way, come into play when even talking about such essential tools of democracy promotion as aid. We additionally see that countries from where migration to the EU originates also receive systematically more aid, disregarding their level of democracy. Again, here, strategic interests of the EU and EU member states override, in a way, democracy promotion objective, which is obviously a very inconsistent approach to democracy promotion. And then The next part of the discussion that relates to the internal factors that can obstruct or facilitate EU's democracy promotion, they show that political dynamics actually play an important role. We studied, in another paper, we studied how European Parliament's resolutions are issued, whether the factors that explain the fact of issuing these resolutions are simply democracy related, or are there any other drivers of these resolutions. So we systematically obtained European Parliament's democratic resolutions that have been published throughout the past 2 decades, again from the early 2000s up till the latest years. And we show that indeed, European Parliament issues democracy-related resolutions when democracy declines in neighboring countries. But at the same time, we can see that with the increased presence of populist radical right parties, this relationship starts to change, weaken a bit, right? As the populist radical right parties are very reluctant to engage externally in democracy promotion, so they do not support this agenda of the European Parliament that in a way weakens the credibility and consistency again of the EU in general, but the European Parliament in particular. But what we also can see that these parties might be more interested in democracy only in those countries, again, from where migration originates, showing strategic engagement with democracy promotion of some parties, well, in this case, populist radical right parties. And again, showing that political dynamics within the EU at the level of EU bodies can obstruct consistent and coherent promotion of democracy externally. We also show in another paper that has been published last year that democracy, when it declines within the EU member states, EU's ability to use conditionality loses its effects. So basically, the association weakens between internal level of liberal democracy and the effects of conditionality that EU uses very often to that it attaches to economic and political integration of third countries. Again, talking to this internal dynamics, internal political dynamics, and how these can undermine the effectiveness of democracy promotion externally. So a few take-home messages that I would like you to remember from this presentation. Well, first of all, the EU's democracy promotion in Eastern Partnership countries in particular is highly sensitive to local political and institutional context. EU responds quite clearly to that. But beyond internal domestic resilience that ENP countries might have, of which we have heard a lot during the first part of the seminar today, EU-level obstacles to effective democracy promotion can hinder the positive effects of democracy promotion. And I highlighted only a couple of those, meaning competing interests such as curtailing migration, but also strategic interests in terms of energy imports. And for democracy promotion to be effective, it must be consistent and credible. And of course, here we have demonstrated with our research that it is not always the case. Lastly, external promotion of democracy is more effective when democratic standards are safeguarded internally within the EU. And this is really important when promoting external democracy, not to forget that the EU has to project a successful picture of internal democracy protection within the EU member states. And if you would like to read more on the papers that I've mentioned during my short talk, I warmly welcome you to check our articles. And with that, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion and receiving your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the recommendations, of course. I would now move to the second speaker. That I would like to be Marina, Dr. Marina Rabinovic. So in the meantime, that she also present her slides, just to remind you that she's from the Redemos project. And her work is mainly on the integration of Ukraine in the EU family, and also the relations between the EU and Ukraine, and also on decentralized governance and local governance at the local level, and also on fundamental rights, such as the very important rule of law, democracy, and good governance. Marina, we see your slides already. Yes, if you can maybe put them in display mode, we can see them a little bit better. Perfect. Amazing. Thank you. And we do not hear you yet. You seems to be still on mute.
Okay, I think now it
Yes.
should be finally fine with all
Loud
the
and clear.
aspects.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just a bit of a complication between the desktop and the browser where I have WebEx open. So I'm very happy to present the input from Redemus. Redemus, as you know, has been oriented solely on the countries of the Eastern Neighbourhood region, and thereby Kyiv School of Economics that I represent today was involved in 2 work packages. One of them has focused on collecting and analyzing data on international EU and member states funding for democracy, human rights, gender equality, rule of law, and good governance in the Eastern Neighbourhood since 2005, and with particular focus on the most recent, say, 15 years since the Lisbon Treaty entered into force. Also, we have been involved in one more work package that aimed at exploring discourses, narratives, and perceptions of EU democracy support within EU institutions and across the East Neighbourhood countries, where the core idea has been to look at whether there has been consonance or dissonance among how the discourses of democracy are being produced in the EU and in the neighborhood countries, and also looked at the perceptions and narratives of democracy promotion. And then what has been innovative there, tried to work with all these 3 categories all together, the discourses, perceptions, including meta-perceptions of the European Commission and other EU institutions regarding themselves and EU as a democracy promoter, and also the narratives of contesters, namely Russia and China. So we have produced quite a number of working papers, which are currently converted into articles, some of them already in the stage of being considered by journals, and also we have produced the database of international and EU funding in the Eastern Neighbourhood, which can be openly accessed via Zenoda, as well as all our working papers that are available both through Zenoda and through the website of Redemus. When it comes to EU democracy funding, what we have found out is that the EU democracy funding has been largely reactive to events in the Eastern Neighbourhood. And if we take a look at the graph on the right side, you can see that at some points, for example, when Russia started its aggression against Ukraine with annexation of Crimea and hybrid war in Donbass, we see funding from EU institutions going up, and in certain points, the funding has been quite linear. We also reviewed that there is a certain, and it has been over almost this whole time, division of labor among international donors as to preferred democracy models. So with the help of our colleagues from Switzerland and Norway and the NU and St. Gallen University, we developed the EU conceptualization of democracy. It's partly based on VDEM, but also includes several additional dimensions. So what we found was, using this model, was that the European Union has mostly focused on peace building and liberal institutional models of democracy, whilst member states really preferred the liberal, and their key focus across all the countries of the East Neighbourhood has been on the rule of law, anti-corruption, media, and say those for democracy. The US, in contrast, and that has been, I think, quite important to include the US, given that the amount of its funding to this neighborhood almost equated to that of member states. Its focus has been on participatory model and stakeholder engagement. So the US really kind of tried to build the webs of democracy support and NGOs capable of supporting democracy in the region, whilst international organizations, we have looked at quite many of them, primarily within the UN framework, but also outside, they focused on egalitarian model of democracy, meaning very much concerned with the socioeconomic conditions in which democracy develops. However, what we can say that, interestingly, the electoral core of democracy didn't receive that much attention, and primarily the support to democracy model focused on elections has been happening only around the election periods. So in between, very, very few projects dealt with the elections infrastructure in the partner countries. So we found that quite an important thing to consider. What we can say in terms of good news is that already prior to the situation when the concept of democratic resilience became the centerpiece for EU democracy promotion, EU democracy funding already very much focused on democratic resilience. This concerns institutions, rule of law, civic engagement, also the commitment to democratic norms and minority rights in a society quite widely. So we have the whole paper that is dedicated to disentangling the concept of democratic resilience and checking whether this earlier EU democracy promotion that we have studied has actually also been directed to democratic resilience without knowing this is democratic resilience as such. However, what we witness now is also the challenge to the participatory aspect of democracy promotion due to the US, due to the shutdown of the USAID. That's quite a challenge because USAID has played a big role also when it comes to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, and beyond. And as I said, the amount of the US funding has been almost equivalent to that of the member states over the period that we have studied. Also, a good question is whether democratic resilience can be seen as the foundation of EU's geopolitical awakening and geopolitical enlargement, and say that we have also dealt quite much with this question because in our opinion, a democracy and geopolitical model of enlargement doesn't necessarily preclude enlargement from being merit-based, and in some cases, democratic resilience is a necessary basis for a geopolitical enlargement to be possible, because if the countries lack democratic resilience, if they are unable to withstand external pressure, it would be very challenging for them both to move towards the EU, irrespective of whether we consider this movement geopolitical or not, and to be able to function as EU member states. So here, and this is something we can discuss further, I would like to challenge this dichotomy between geopolitical and merit-based, because in our project, through the concept of democratic resilience, we show that there is a lot of potential for synergizing democracy, democratic resilience, and geopolitical enlargement. Then our second aspect and second work package we have worked with showed that there is really challenge of achieving relational coherence between democracy discourses in UN countries and EU democracy discourses. So there has been a lot of copy pasting over the last almost 20 years that we have studied. However, the fact that something is copy-pasted into national strategies or strategies of NGOs doesn't mean that these norms are internalized. So this is something we show in work package 7. And also what we managed to find out is that the EU's meta-perception of itself as a democracy actor do influence democracy discourses. So when the EU officials think the EU is not that capable or lacks, let's say, ambition as a democracy actor, then they automatically, in a way, reduce ambitions of democracy promotion, which leaves quite much room for contesting powers like Russia and China, whose narratives were also explored in detail, to challenge EU's approach to democracy promotion in the region. So what we recommend is to strengthen local ownership and create a kind of broader discursive space for democracy in the region. So this means that the EU shouldn't insist on its partners very much complying to what the EU itself says, but tries to put these norms into the discursive and relational spaces so that partners have a stronger role in let's say, modifying them to a certain extent and creating a shared understanding of them rather than doing what the EU does and not having a discussion on respective norms. So to conclude, we nowadays go through the period of the geopoliticization of the EU's role in the Eastern Neighbourhood and the attempts the EU makes to reinvent itself as a geopolitical actor. Democratic resilience is crucial to ensure successful geopolitical enlargement because without this, the democracy, but also the rule of law, human rights, and other core norms of the EU would be eroding, with contesting powers very much happy and contributing to such erosion. It's necessary that the EU finds new ways to engage specifically with the electoral and participatory democracy models, as well as contributes to creating a broader and more diverse space for democracy discourses in the region. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Marina. Thank you very much also to bring this good news angle to the whole discussion, because it's somehow very needed. Now, also before presenting and giving the floor to Funda, just a reminder to all the participants online. I mean, if you have questions, please leave them in the chat. You will be, of course, having the possibility to raise your hand and voice them. And if not, I can certainly voice them to the speakers for you, because we would like, especially the last part of this panel discussion, to be an opportunity for all of you to engage with the speakers. So, Professor Funda Tekin from Invigorate EU. Her work instead focuses mostly on the integration at the European Union level, particularly when it comes to the enlargement to the new countries. And also, she's going to be the very important speaker bringing insights on the EU-Turkey relations. So without further ado, Funda, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello everybody. I hope you can see my my slides.
Yes, we do.
That I presented. And first of all, thank you for organizing this seminar and also the very interesting contributions that we heard so far. And I think what I'm going to elaborate today on is directly linking into what my previous or where my previous speakers have also left off. I mean, Marina was just raising the question in terms of, you know, how can we conceive democratic resilience as part of the geopolitical awakening? And I think this is really something where our project, I'm representing the Horizon Europe project Invigorate EU, where we try to find the solutions on how to invigorate the enlargement and neighborhood policy for a resilient Europe. I decided today to present a bit on our findings of how we integrated the democratization issues into our research and our models that we used. But this was part of the work package 4, and those two work package leaders today unfortunately were not available due to other commitments. So I'm briefly going to present their insights a bit. And then I also decided, since Turkey was included into today's discussions, but Turkey is not really part of the geopolitical awakening of enlargement so far. And I'm going to try to a bit provide insights why this might be the case and where we stand with regards to Turkey. So just briefly, with regards to the Invigorate EU consortium, we are 18 partners. It's a large consortium. It's jointly coordinated by Michael Keding from University Duisburg-Essen and myself, me being the scientific lead. We have partners in the countries in the Western Balkan and Eastern Neighbourhood, and also within the European Union. I also decided to show you briefly how we structured our work and our analysis, the so-called work package structure, because this already kind of, picks up what Marina also said with regards to, the merit-based approach and the geopolitical push currently, and how can we actually combine those two. And when we conceived Invigorate EU, I was really thinking along the lines, there's the modernization logic, and then there's the geopolitical logic, and of course in the modernization logic being the merit-based approach, the democratization context. Democratization is of course an important part of that logic. But basically, and this is what I'm going to elaborate on today, those two logics speak to one another, and we actually have to look into how democratization actually is playing out in a geopolitical, in a contested context, and a post-conflict or post-conflict context. So with regards to resilience, because that is of course also a very important part of our research aim. Of course, resilience is a contested buzzword. The general definition is the ability of societies or communities to adapt to complex crisis and reorganize within a constantly changing equilibrium. And then we had, assumptions and, how this plays out in the modernization logic, where we said it's more, strengthening the inside of the outside here, meaning the outside in terms of non-EU countries, so the outside of the European Union, and the geopolitical logic then more focusing on strengthening the outside of the outside, so strengthening those countries also for external interference, hybrid threats, and countering other global actors' ambitions. So if we now look more into the democratization research that we've done and the thinking that lies behind it, as I said, geopolitical matters. That was a very important assumption for our research on the democratization, because then we see that democratic resilience is tested amid a turbulent geopolitical environment. So resilience does not only mean merely institutional endurance, but the capacity of states and societies to navigate an increasingly contested geopolitical landscape while preserving reform momentum and societal trust. So while the traditional democratization models emphasize peaceful institutional transitions through free elections, checks and balances, political pluralism, civil society vibrancy, and human rights protections, we actually also see a securitization of democratization, and with that, democracy support becomes a strategic resilience tool. This means that democracy support is not only framed as a normative goal, but also securitized as a strategic imperative linked to regional stability and resilience. And then, of course, you have, and this is what Karina was pointing out, of course, you have different political contexts and different sensitivities depending on the country, how this is going to play out then. But basically, resilience is then more an adaptive resilience, whereby democratic institutions and societal agency must continuously adjust, withstand, and recover in face of hybrid threats and geopolitical contestations like territorial occupation. You have Abkhazia and Transnistria, energy coercion, disinformation campaigns, and even military invasion. So basically, democratization then plays out in a complex interplay between local democratic dynamics and broader geopolitical pressures. And this multi-level lens examines how EU conditionality, regional actors like Russia, domestic institutions, and grassroots agencies interact, revealing blockages and breakthroughs. And depending on the national context and also the political context, this, of course, also plays out in different ways regarding the three countries of the former association trio, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. So we then basically said that, with regards to To Georgia, we see a securitized hollowing, which describes a democratization dynamic where securitization discourse, like framing democracy as a security imperative, paradoxically enables institutional erosion under prolonged hybrid pressure. This is at the international level, robust conditionality. Conditionality signals normative commitment, but proves insufficient against entrenched regional threats like territorial incursions, proxy militia, and sustained disinformation ecosystems that amplify existential vulnerabilities. But then there is a counterbalance in Georgia, and that's a societal counterbalance mechanism, and that is actually the autonomous non-state agency manifesting through transnational youth networks, independent media ecosystems, and public opinion majorities that emerge as the primary resilience vector in terms of the society being still very pro-EU integration, and there is a democratic commitment in Georgia. With regards to Moldova, there's the model of hybrid consolidation, which is conceptualized as gradual democratic deepening through the fusion of security and normative instruments in protected low intensity conflicts, achieving equilibrium where securitization reinforces rather than undermines pluralism. And then finally, we have the wartime hybridization that conceptualizes accelerated adaptive democratization under existential high-intensity conflict, where securitization reaches its zenith, yet catalyzes hybrid governance structures, being blended coercion with innovation. So basically, there it's really embedded in the wartime conflict in terms of the democratization issues. So we, Giselle and Richard, produced a long policy report on all those three models and how this actually plays out. But I think it's really important to see that the geopolitical context really does matter for the democratization impact and the models that play out in the different countries. Now, if you kind of look at Turkey, and here, I mean, one general observation that you have with Turkey is actually that their democratization is not really securitized, or at least it is not, from the EU and EU's democracy support is not securitized. So it's not really in the geopolitical context in terms of conflicts and contested areas. And this might also be part of the answer why Turkey is not really part of the geopolitical push that is behind the enlargement policy since 2022 that we see, but that there is actually still stagnation with regards to also democracy in the country, but also democracy promotion from the EU side, and also in terms of the entire accession process. So Turkey is really more seen as a strategic partner in the sense of from the perspective of the EU. So we really see, currently, and this is basically the three periods that you can see with regards to political and legislative reforms in Turkey ever since Turkey became a candidate country back in 1999. So we had a first period of acceleration right up to the state where accession negotiations started. You had a lot of reforms, a lot of movements, a very constructive and productive area of democracy development in Turkey. And then right after the accession negotiations started from 2007 to 2012, we can actually say that there was a period of recess, so less reforms, stagnating reforms. And then since the Gezi Park protest in 2013, this is basically perceived as a turning point, you really can see a period of backsliding and now having autocratization trends also in Turkey, and that, of course, is then the question of how to deal with that. and what actually, how you can then promote further, strengthen the democratic resilience and state of democracy in Turkey. One factor of democratic resilience in Turkey is the civil society. I think that is something that is important to note. If you look at election participation and so the population and civil society, that is a strong resilience factor in Turkey. If you think about democracy promotion from the EU side, that is definitely a sector where the focus should be in order to build up also the country's democracy from that perspective. With regards to other areas that the EU could do, I think a very important factor for the success or potential success of democracy promotion in Turkey. I mean, Karina was already highlighting the importance of the internal levels of democracy also within Europe, and I think this is also very important for the Turkish case. But I think what's also very important is the credibility and trust in the accession procedure, and then in the perspective, Turkey's perspective with regards to EU-Turkey relations and Turkey's place within Europe. So for me, it's always a bit difficult to always say, the external democracy promotion should not, at least from my perspective, should not be the only factor for democracy and democratization reforms in a country. And this is a bit, I always give the example also with regards to judicial reforms. I mean, in the Turkish debate, there's a strong argument, as long as chapters 23 and 24 of the accession negotiations are blocked, we will not be able to reform our judicial systems. But I think, each nation should have an intrinsic reform, intrinsic motivation to be a democratic democracy and have to comply with the democratic standards. And then I think some accession negotiation chapters can only facilitate those procedures. But still, trust and credibility in the EU is something that is important with regards to democracy promotion in Turkey. And then I think with regards to how to break up the credibility dilemma and also the trust issue, I think considering forms of flexibility and differentiation in terms of potential future forms of accession and integrating accession candidates into the European Union might be part of the answer, because that is something that might at least kind of square the circle between the merit-based approach and the geopolitical shift with regards to the accession. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Funda. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like now to start with the panel discussion, with the real panel discussion. We have 40 minutes altogether. I urge again the participants to leave their questions in the chat or just to raise their hand so I can actually give them the floor. And to start, to kick off the panel discussion, I would like also to follow on what Funda was briefly starting to mention about the reforms in the enlargement countries. And I had a question for the three of you, for the whole panel, a general question on the enlargement process, and more specifically on these so-called fundamentals, as they call fundamentals in the renewed 2020 enlargement methodology. In your opinion, which are, and also based, of course, on your research and your colleagues' research, in your opinion, which are the values? Like I can mention the rule of law, but there's also the respect of fundamental rights, but can be others that are being highlighted by the EU negotiators as non-negotiable. And how do you think that the European Union, the European institutions, do link these principles, the respect for those values, for those principles, directly linked to the security and its own security and internal stability of the EU? I don't know who wants to go first, but feel free.
Maybe I could, if
definitely.
That's fine.
Thank you, Karina. Yes.
Thank you for an interesting question. Indeed, the fundamentals are really important as they are opening and closing any accession negotiations. So they are something that the EU starts with and finishes with. We have conducted a systematic study of the Commission's opinion on countries' applications for EU membership. We compared Commission's opinion on Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, and we found out that in fact something between 71 and 86% of all of the recommendations relate to the fundamentals. So that shows how important fundamentals are quantitatively, numerically, if you like. Yeah. And of course, the most frequent and the most elaborated references, according to our opinion, were made to the rule of law, meaning to judicial independence, separation of powers, but also related to other issues such as electoral democracy, fight against corruption, which was mentioned in all of the discussions by the Commission, in all of the documents by the Commissions, as well as media freedom, de-oligarchization. It is a very complicated word. So basically, regulations fighting oligarchs, which was mentioned in 3 out of 4 countries except Bosnia and Herzegovina. Anti-money laundering regulation, human rights, of course, and protection of vulnerable groups that was mentioned in all of the countries. So these were based on the Commission's opinion, systematic study. And what we indeed also see that while processing country level reports by the Commission, that there is much more progress in some countries compared to others, particularly in terms of judicial interdependence and democracy. And these countries are Ukraine and Moldova. Perhaps somehow unsurprisingly, in terms of reforms, these were highlighted in much more positive terms compared to Georgia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example. And we also checked reports on Kosovo, where progress was often assessed as limited to some progress, right? So in this sense, I wanted to come back to the discussion that Funda and Marina already started regarding geopolitical versus merit-based enlargement. So this results in a way show that the current wave of enlargement is a combination of both rather than being one or the other. It is merit-based, as we can see, very strong positive language throughout the years related to Ukraine, even prior to the full-scale invasion. Moldova and Ukraine systematically show good progress, good and some progress, whereas Georgia and Bosnia-Herzegovina showed some to limited to even stalled progress. And this is a language that the Commission uses. So here we can see that 2 countries, Moldova and Ukraine at least, can be characterized as merit-based potential member states, based on which kind of enlargement is happening, and much less progress has been achieved by Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, of course. Where granting candidacy status to Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina can be perhaps explained better by geopolitical approach to enlargement.
Thank you very much, Karina.
Maybe I could add to that directly, because I agree with what Karina has said with regards also to the messaging of the Commission and the European Union, and of course also the annual reports on the candidate countries. But I think one sign, and their fundamentals are key. I fully agree. But one sign which really also highlights that there is also the geopolitical dynamic behind it is that you also know that those reports now also put an emphasis on the degree of CFSP acquis alignment, and I think that is really the difference from to previous reports. It's not only the fundamentals being key, but also it's really monitored the CFSP acquis alignment, and that of course is then the security dimension behind it. So it's you need to comply with the fundamentals, but you also need to basically be in line with the EU's foreign policy and, of course, also security policy. So I think that is important. And then how to break it up. And I think here it's really something where I think the flexibility and differentiation might be an answer. However, the one term that has not now also been used, where it was the discussion that a Ukraine accession to the EU might be part of the peace agreement, and then the so-called reversed enlargement. So first membership, and then acquis, and then the finalization of the compliance. And here I'm rather skeptical, because that would kind of take the leverage of the European Union from the European Union's hand, I would say. But I think there is still lots of thinking to be put into the different forms of flexibility and differentiation. But I think that might be part of the answer.
Nice, thank you, Funda. Marina, I don't know if you have anything to add to this, or
I think we could proceed.
I'm checking the chat. If I don't see any question for now. So let me continue with a question specifically, maybe for Funda again, if you agree, on the opposition to the enlargement process and the contestation of the enlargement process in these accession countries. What do you think is the primary source of resistance to the EU democracy support in these candidate countries, specifically, of course, in the Eastern Partnership countries? Turkey, maybe we can talk about Turkey in a few minutes.
Well, I think the resistance part to the support might be, of course, rather be visible in the sense that well, I would need to think about that. Well, I think that this is, of course, part, I mean, in democracy support is, of course, those actors that are more leaning towards, other global ambitions. I think if you look into, and we have an external interference index within our project, where you see that you have other actors like Russia, China, that are active in the regions. So that, of course, also might contribute to being more resistant with regards to democracy support, because if you then have also, for example, other actors that fund or provide funding in the region without, the strings attached of needs for democratization, of course, that is something that might then be more a competition towards the European Union's democracy support. So I think that is something to look into. I also said, and this is why I was putting the question to Sonja in the first panel, I also think that, of course, once you have structures that are already very a lot of backsliding and towards autocratization, there might be a turning point where it's simply very difficult to provide the structures and the funding to the actors that might be open and hoping for the support, because simply it's structurally not possible, or it even puts those actors at risk.
Interesting. No, thank you very much, Funda. And also following up on what you just said, I mean, you were mentioning, of course, security threats that are also hampering and slowing down the accession process and creating opposition and contestation to the enlargement process in these countries. I wanted to turn to Marina, and specifically on your experience, on your studies and research on Ukraine and Moldova. Because also Funda before and also Karina, I think they mentioned the disinformation and foreign interference and one of the main factors that are hampering the accession process. And I wanted to know whether you observed, you or your colleagues in the project, in the consortium, observed any change in the influence operations by Russia in this region, in Ukraine and Moldova, since the beginning of the war. And if you can identify any blind spot in the response of the EU, of the European institutions, and of course of other member states, if you can, that are not noticeable.
Yeah, thank you. I think it has been traditionally a challenge for Ukraine and Moldova with Russian operations, largely because of the language factor, because a lot of people in Ukraine and Moldova don't know Russian, and many use Russian as in many aspects. Therefore, it has always been not that challenging for Russia to understand what kind of discourses and narratives there are in Ukraine and Moldova and try to influence them. So I think following the full-scale invasion, the language-induced change make it a bit more challenging for Russia to conduct influence operations, and there are even quite some jokes and memes about Russia using Google Translate and then posting some messages in Ukrainian, which don't make sense exactly because there are some collocations they don't manage to translate correctly. However, they do adapt and they try now also to enter the Ukrainian and in Moldova the Romanian language space. So I think their disinformation now becomes more targeted, more AI powered, which we can also see in many social media channels. And traditionally, the thing that doesn't change, they try to split Ukrainians and try to undermine social cohesion. So now there are just new groups that they can target this disinformation against. If we speak, for example, about war veterans, it would be common for them to say, Ukrainian state doesn't want to care about you, you have been at war for nothing, and so on. Then, for example, they try to develop some dividing lines between people who left Ukraine amid the full-scale invasion and those who stayed. Also, they use this information to amplify the effects of campaigns against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, pushing for disillusionment on the one side and kind of trying to say that there is no chance for Ukraine to survive anymore. Anyway, so let us come to peace on the Russian terms as soon as possible. So I think they are also quite skilled in combining physical influence and cognitive influence, and that is something I think Ukrainians also know quite well already. And at least there have been no, as Russia hoped, significant protests or something which would have been based on these double physical and cognitive influence. I think that's an important point, and this points to the presence of also cognitive resilience among Ukrainians. And I think what the Commission could do is to have stronger emphasis on these cognitive aspects generally, and probably trying to, both on the conceptual level, look more into cognitive threats, how they work, how exactly they try to influence people's cognition, but also develop instruments that can help tackle them. But also not least important, especially in the Ukrainian case, is the assistance with going over the physical consequences of Russia's intervention. And not least important is to stay credible and not promise things that the European Union cannot deliver. I think that is very important under the circumstances when people are already tired and frustrated and really want something to happen. If you promise something should happen, that should happen. I've just been to the Cafe Kiev in Berlin, the biggest event on Ukraine in Europe, and several members of European Parliament there demonstrated very strong awareness, particularly of this point that promising fast-track accession, for example, not being able to deliver is probably the worst thing the EU can currently do to Ukraine, as well as probably to Moldova, which is also very much influenced by Russia's aggression and its consequences. Thank you.
Because this would backlash. I understand. And a link to this, we have a question from the audience, which is also very much related to what you just said. And this is maybe for Karina, but from the Embrace project, but it can be for the whole panel as well. Nejla, but my pronunciation is not very good, is asking whether the two let's say, enlargement processes, the one for the Western Balkans on the one side and the one for the Eastern Partnership for Moldova and Ukraine, like Marina just mentioned, are somehow different. How that differentiates, if there are also different theories, moving and justifying these differences, and how this basically plays out. So if any of you wants to jump into this question.
I can start, if you
Yes,
don't mind. Thank you for a very interesting question, Naila. Indeed, the two regions and their trajectories towards European integration broadly is very much different. As I try to highlight in my presentation, obviously, Western Balkans have received the clearly articulated promise of European membership perspectives in 2003. So they have started the process slowly, of course, with some issues, but the process has been ongoing for the past more than 2 decades. And of course, that process was very much obstructed by the lack of political will from the side of some European leaders to incorporate Western Balkan countries, not least due to significant share of Muslim population in some of the countries, such as Bosnia, for instance, which was very much a political decision for some leaders in the past. But also there was a very much widespread and might still be a widespread feeling of enlargement fatigue among the broader population in Europe. And this protracted European integration path, of course, has created or contributed very much to European skepticism among populations in the region, right? And therefore, we can see sometimes, maybe to some of us, surprising numbers in the popularity of Euroscepticism, for instance, in Serbia, that has been highlighted during the first part of the webinar today. In Ukraine, on the contrary, and Moldova and Georgia, although the aspiration to become one day a member state has been persistent, and in one of my papers I trace it back to the early 90s in case of Ukraine, there was not enough political commitment from the side of the EU and member states to accept Eastern partners in the future as member states. And there was promised everything but political integration. We have seen much developed economic relationship, much assistance, whatnot, even visa-free travels, but political integration was explicitly avoided in the relationship with these countries. But despite of that, these countries wanted to become member states, right? And widely supported by population, a vision that was widely supported by population. And we haven't seen that much of Euroscepticism yet among those countries, since it is a much more recent development when these 3 countries in this partnership received the prospect of becoming member states, obtaining candidacy statuses in 2022 and 23. So yes, long story short, the 2 regions are extremely different from one another. The level of Euroscepticism is very much different. They have very different trajectories towards European integration, very different internal relationship, so to say, between the regional neighbors, which is very important in the context of European integration, but perhaps somehow becoming more similar as Eastern partners are currently living either in the context of full-scale war like Ukraine, or very much affected by that, meaning all other countries in Eastern Partnership countries. So in that sense, maybe the countries are becoming more similar in terms of legacies that wars, unfortunately, breed, such as grievances, such as feeling of injustice, whatnot.
Great, thank you. Any other speaker wants to contribute to maybe make the distinction between the 2 types of approach to enlargement? No. I don't see any other question from the chat. I would like to ask something to Funda about civil society and grassroots movements, because I was wondering, also before we talked about this fundamental first approach, let's say, the person given to the rule of law, to a number of other reforms in the accession countries. And I was wondering how this approach can affect the support for civil society organizations and among civil society organizations and grassroots movements to the overall enlargement process, specifically in Ukraine and Moldova, but of course, feel free to bring insights from other countries as well.
Of course, the fundamentals first approach is something that puts an emphasis and a focus light on the civil society organizations and grassroots root actors, because they first of all have then also the opportunity to to promote their actions if they are in favor of judicial reforms, for example, or also democratic reforms. But I think what is also important, particularly for Ukraine and Moldova, to then for those civil society organizations also to try to have a mutual learning effect from one another, so that they can have the spaces to actually act and meet and discuss and try to find also actions and solutions together. But I think this is, of course, something that with the fundamentals being on liberal values, freedom of speech, all those liberal values that are part of the fundamentals. That, of course, puts basically a flashlight on the civil society organizations, and can and then for them also to act and be supported. But this also means that for the European Union, it is not only sufficient to put the fundamentals first, but it's also then important, and I think this is what Sonja presented also in the first panel, to enable those civil society organizations actually to take action and to also be in a productive actors within the process.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. I would move to Marina with a specific question on Georgia, because we mentioned Georgia before, but we spoke a lot about Ukraine, Moldova, and the Western Balkans, of course. Also speaking about Moldova and Ukraine, we have seen that the two countries have done major reforms, also given the exceptional situation in which they both are, especially Ukraine, under extreme pressure. But Georgia was also under great pressure from Russia and from other external actors. We should not forget that. Is moving instead towards an opposite direction when it comes to EU accession and democratization altogether. What do you think explains? Which are the also internal drivers? If you can make some sort of give a broader picture, internal drivers that explain this difference.
In our project, we had two Georgian partners, so we could basically, while interacting with them, observe them moving from some kind of, let's say, moderate optimism to moderate pessimism, and then entire pessimism about how the situation there develops. I think it's really largely external pressure plus the government's readiness to not resist this pressure, and probably have this feeling that the government there is also kind of afraid as they witness the situation in Ukraine and they see how dreadful it is to be in war with Russia, and Russia uses that quite much. I don't think there are real internal intra-societal drivers there, even though I'm not an expert in Georgia, and this judgment relies mainly on communicating with our Georgian colleagues and with them. I think that is something that society tries to go against, and we have witnessed quite some protests which, by their spirit reminded me a lot about Maidans in Ukraine. Nevertheless, it's just that the society didn't have much capacity and enough capacity to go against the government and overthrow the government. Because, I lived through this experience of Euromaidan and also this feeling of in-betweenness, whether Yanukovych will stay or not. At some points, it really seemed that Maidan would not win and Yanukovych will be with us maybe still. And that's why I think that's very much what happened in Georgia, that just their balance went to the side of the government influenced by pro-Russian forces. So and I don't believe something is going to change soon, because if we see the situation in Belarus, for example, after the 2020 protests, nothing changed much. In Georgia, the society is more vibrant and vital, probably, and more capable of doing something. But if it hadn't succeeded now, there is a need of some external push again for it to be able to get a new drive for protests and changing something there. So the youth will just wait and think that something can be changed now there.
No, thank you very much for bringing these insights, also giving your experience and of your partners in Georgia. Speaking about the democracy promotion, of course, of the EU in these countries, you mentioned now that maybe the situation in Georgia is not really determined by internal factors, mostly by external factors that actually influence the trajectory of the country. But I would still like to understand which are the role of domestic factors that can facilitate or obstruct the democracy promotion and the democracy support of the EU in this in the accession countries. And maybe this question is more for Karina, if you can actually contextualize this in the countries in which you have been working on. Which are the internal factors that can whether support the efforts of the EU or hamper them?
Thank you very much, Alberto, for your interesting question. Indeed, domestic factors are decisive for the effects of EU's external democracy promotion, and there's countless articles written and books written on this particular topic. One interesting recent finding that I would like to bring up, something that we have discovered in the Embrace project. We looked particularly on the effects of EU's democracy assistance aid, basically assistance that is given for promoting civil society, but also supporting democratic institutions in countries. Interestingly, we found that this aid is more likely to have a positive impact on the level of democracy, electoral democracy in recipient countries, under the conditions of more developed public administrations institutions. So basically, the stronger state capacity in the recipient countries was, the more positive effect one can expect as a result of financial assistance targeting democratic institutions in recipient countries, which shows us that in addition to all of those factors that literature has already explored, including interests of powerful water players in the countries, including also party constellations, whatnot, even the sort of say boring factors such as quality of public administrations institutions are really important. Because if you think about that logically, it kind of makes sense. If funding is landed in a country which has troubles managing day-to-day public administration tasks, there's no way this funding can be put effectively into action, contributing to the overall level of democracy, even if there's no corruption, right? And we know, of course, that weak institutions, they correlate a lot with levels of corruption. But in a system that is well functioning, that can fulfill its everyday obligations, this money is less likely to be burdensome. But this money is more likely to be put into practice, because these states are more likely to have a transparent system, accountability system, ways to monitor how money is being spent, how they've been allocated, making sure that this money goes into action rather than is wasted and is a burden for local administrations to handle. So this is something new that we found in our project that hasn't been highlighted in the literature so far. So.
Thank you very much. No, super interesting. And now I will take this opportunity to turn to Funda and ask somehow the same question, but about Turkey. If you can enlighten us, which are the domestic, also political dynamics in Turkey, which is always very interesting, that affect the influence of the EU in supporting the transition to democracy and the respect of the rule of law.
Yeah, thank you very much. A very topical and relevant question, but also not the easiest question. I think if you think about the EU's influence in Turkey, and maybe I'm going to start with the population, because I said that was one of the most important factors also for democratic resilience in Turkey. And you see a strong support for for EU's accession to the EU in the Turkish population. I mean, in the past years or past decade, it had been higher, but still it is at 65-70%. So there is still really strong support for Turkey becoming an EU member state. However, on the other side, if you then ask them whether they believe if this is going to happen, this percentage actually drops down to only about 40% or so. So, you know, there is a strong will to exceed, but the belief that it's going to happen is actually going down. And that, of course, creates a huge frustration. So I think this, of course, is something where then the actions, and this brings me back to the credibility and trust issue of the European Union, that diminishes the conditionality also within the country. And of course, you know, the political elites can play with that then too, you know, and this also then brings me back to the entire debate, you know, opening chapters 23 and 24. In order to reform our judicial system, I think this is an argument that you frequently hear in Turkey, but for me, it's simply not a valid argument. So, but this shows basically in how far the entire procedure has undermined the leverage that the European Union has in Turkey. And of course, it can also be used for, you know, justifying why reforms are not happening because the process as such is not happening. However, if you then realize that, you know, the reforms started to stagnate right after the accession negotiations started, you know, this is all a very complex issues. And then, of course, you also have might have also other alternatives to the European Union. But this is also an argument where I don't think that you know, there are real other credible options for Turkey to join if they really would want to, you know, to be a strong, well, benefit from the single market and benefit equally from economically from other organizations. But this also maybe brings me a bit back to the Ukraine issue, because I always think, you know, and this is also what Marina said, you know, fast tracking Ukraine is also or at least fast tracking the promises to Ukraine might actually also undermine, you know, the credibility of that procedure. You know, if then the EU does not live up to what its promises, this might create also frustration within Ukraine. And of course, also, I mean, you can also look into, Anna Maya was pointing it out in the previous panel, you know, also the Western Balkans have also been in the procedure for a very long time. So I think this is, of course, something that needs to be put in question. And then, of course, you know, really, because you were asking for the internal factors, of course, also the state of backsliding of democracy is also something to keep in mind. So how can you still have a handle on the political actors in the country, and or whether you are politicized and instrumentalized, and that might actually backfire then.
Mm-hmm. And I also would like to follow up on this, because also talking about domestic actors, I would be curious to know whether there are any alternative models. I mean, Europe been speaking about Turkey, but I mean also in other countries. I mean, there is this model of illiberal democracy. I mean, Orban style, but also other sources of integration in other blocks, in the Eurasian bloc, and so on for some of the countries of the region. Of course, not for all. Are there any alternative model promoted by internal actors? Is this succeeding somehow in reframing the democracy support by the European Union, by Western allies, as problematic, as something that the country should not seek? What can you tell us? I mean, you, Funda, but also the other speakers from your case studies, from your projects.
Yeah, maybe I can start with Turkey, because I was already referring to it, because I really think, you know, there is the discussion on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you know, the Eurasian Economic Union and all that, but this does not really have traction in the political debate, because it is simply not as attractive, both in economic terms, but also in terms of geopolitical cooperation, at least in Turkey, that this is really a viable option that that, you know, they are playing with. But of course, it's it's used in the debate to simply say, well, we do have other opportunities, so to use it as a leverage maybe towards the European Union, but so far this is not the strongest argument to counter the European offer, at least in Turkey.
Interesting. So we have still a few minutes before the end of the webinar. Let me check if there are any questions. No, I don't see anything from the chat. Maybe a very last one, as we have a couple of minutes, on the judiciary and the reforms in this sector. How can this judicial capture, as it's called, be prevented in these enlargement countries? Are there any reforms which are actually undergoing? And if you can tell us anything from the evidence that have been collected. And this, I don't know who wants to bring some insights. I will not go for Funda again because I already grilled her a bit.
Yeah, I can do if you want.
From Ukraine and Moldova, it would be super interesting.
Yes, again, the judicial independence and impartiality issues have been central for Ukraine and Moldova all the time. And I would say that these reforms, they are in a way never ending because there are still new aspects that come into play. And also what's problematic is that judicial systems adapt in a way to new conditions and find different ways how to circumvent. And I think what's really important is the combination of internal and external pressure, because when there are both, then it's in a way easier to influence leadership. And again, this is what I brought from the Cafe Kyiv, that I think it's also the EU's perspective that when they don't have enough cooperation with NGOs or NGOs experience pressure from the leadership, then the rule of law reforms get stuck. And I think this is also what the EU can do when it comes to both investigating where the gaps are in NGO funding that deal with anti-corruption, rule of law, and similar things after the USAID is gone, and assess strategically which of these gaps the EU can fill. It's definitely not all of them, and some, the recommendation has already taken place because it has been a while since the USAID is not functioning anymore in Ukraine. But nevertheless, I think it's important to constantly reconsider which NGOs are in play and whether they have enough resources and the extent to which the EU can help them get out from the pressure from the national administrations. And I think unfortunately in Ukraine, the opportunities for such pressure have been quite high during the full-scale invasion. And it's only now when the cabinet changed that there is a new window of opportunity to promote the rule of law reforms. Thank you.
Amazing. No, thank you very much, Marina. Thank you for these insights. I don't see any contribution from the participants in the chat. We reached the end of the webinar. So already thank you very much to the three of you for being with us, for sharing your research and your insights. Thank also to the other projects that have been presented today, also in the previous webinar, the one moderated by Anne on the Western Balkans. So to all the participants, this has been recorded, so this will be available online, of course. We're going to be sharing a few background materials, notably the fact sheet with all the links and relevant links to relevant materials from the 7 projects. And well, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much to Policy Answers, to the ZIA and the rest of the team for organizing this and to put all of us more in contact, let's say. And with this, I wish you all a very nice and pleasant day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.